Hello, welcome to our 2024 Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series. To paraphrase James Baldwin, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And this is certainly true of all the inequities that have traditionally shaped the design industry. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here in Storrs, Connecticut is the territory of the Mohegan, Manchatucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Today's event, Diversifying Design, Inclusion Through Mentorship and Collaboration, will feature a presentation by our guest speaker, Lisa Elsie Mercer, followed by a Q&A featuring questions from our students and the virtual audience. Reminder to our YouTube watchers to please take advantage of the YouTube chat box to paste any questions for our guests, which we will try to answer during the discussion portion. My name is Heather Elliott Familaro, and I'm the department head for digital media and design and a digital artist and filmmaker. And we are excited to talk about our department, which is a young department founded 10 years ago, which has rapidly grown to over 350 undergraduate students and 25 graduate students with 25 full-time faculty. And we have 7 undergraduate concentrations across the full digital media spectrum from film production, animation, interactive design, business, and the humanities, both at the Storrs and Stanford campuses here in Connecticut. In our department, we value and celebrate our students' diverse backgrounds, and we support their development, both as individuals and as professional media creators. Now in its 4th year, the Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series is one celebration of those shared values. So now on to the show. It is my extreme pleasure to welcome today's co-hosts, DMD students Kennedy Evans, Hayden Kerr, and Melina Sandel. Come on up. Kennedy Evans is a versatile visual experience architect currently wearing multiple hats as the graphic designer for the undergraduate student government Subag Outreach Committee Vice Chair of Design and web designer for Championship Labs. Kennedy's work spans graphic design, committee leadership, and web design. Kennedy's collaborative approach values inclusivity and her core principles shaping the future of design. Welcome,
Hello.
Kennedy.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
And next to Kennedy, we've got Hayden Kerr, a senior in DMD with a concentration in web development. His biggest passion is delicately combining design and code to create visually appealing interactive projects that spark curiosity and joy. Most notably, Hayden is polishing his senior project that consists of an interactive exhibit that aims to introduce children to the wonders of the solar system through 2D and 3D representations of the planets. And I'll remind everyone that our BFA exhibition opens on Friday night, just at 4:30 with screenings at 3 and 6:30. So we'll hope you'll join us there, and welcome, Hayden.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And then finally, we've got Melinda Sandel. And she is a UX designer at Greenhouse Studios and the Yukon DX Group. She is currently a junior at the University of Connecticut, where she's majoring in web and interactive media design. Melina has an inquisitive spirit and channels that energy into her user research for her different projects. She designs under the philosophy that accessibility should be at the forefront of the process rather than an afterthought. Thank you for that. Currently, Melina is working on designing an accessible web map that plots cemeteries in mental institutions. In her free time, Melina enjoys reading celebrity memoirs. Welcome, Melina.
Thank you. I'm so glad I get to be a part of this conversation.
Us too. And now on to our special guest, Lisa Elsie Mercer. She, her, hers is a designer, educator, and researcher. Her interests are in developing and executing design interventions that fuel and sustain responsible design for social impact. The developed frameworks and tools are intended to create a space for conversation and knowledge exchange where participants can collaborate in creating new ideas and solutions. This type of methodology is evidenced in her current project focused on the topics of human trafficking, incarceration, rape, and racism. Elsie Mercer is an associate professor of graphic design and design for responsible innovation in the School of Art and Design at the College of Fine and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. The College of Fine and Applied Arts awarded Elsie Mercer with the Excellence in Research for the 2020-2021 academic year. Elsie Mercer has presented at national and international conferences, including AIGA, the American Institute of Graphic Art Design's Education Community Conference, Cumulus Association, the International Association of Universities of College of Art, Design, and Media, European Academy of Design, Design and Diversity Conference, and she currently serves as a National Steering Committee member on the AIG DEC, the Design Educators Community. Elsie Mercer holds a BFA in Visual Communication and Design from Purdue University and a Master of Design Research from the University of North Texas. She worked in the industry for 15 years and for 5 years was the owner of Mercer Studio in Denver, Colorado. Her roles included project management, interaction design, mobile application development, and design research. So welcome, Lisa, and I'm going to hand it over to you to start your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. We're having some claps in here. I'm going to try and get this set up really quickly. Make sure I do this right. Nope, nope, I definitely didn't do it right. Okay. Okay. Perfect. I think it's showing up. All right. Well, thank you all for inviting me. Looking forward to presenting my work that I've been doing. I'm going to give you some background on me and who I am. My name is, again, Lisa Elsie Mercer. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor of graphic design and design for responsible innovation at the University of Illinois. I'm completing my 7th year there. As she mentioned, I received my undergrad from Purdue University in 2000, and I had a guidance and advisor who said, you know, the internet is going to be big, so you should take coding. And at the time, coding really wasn't, it was like we were still teaching HTML and CSS. And so I did. And because of that, I was automatically put into a web design position right outside of graduation. Initially, I was really disappointed because I thought I wanted to be a print designer, but the more interaction design I did and the more I learned on the job, I was super excited because you could see where it was going even in 2000. After working in industry for 15 years, I decided to go back to academia and get my MFA. And that is really where I started to think about how I could utilize my knowledge of a front-end web developer towards complex social change. Before, I was doing like human-centered design and design research process and working with people to learn about what they were doing and how they were using digital technologies, and then garnering that information and implementing it into my designs. But it really wasn't until I was getting my graduate degree that I really considered, like, how could I apply this to complex social issues? So the first major project that I did as a research project back in academia was called Operation Compass. And this was focused on human trafficking. So my first initial thought, I was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I started to wonder where people were most likely to see victims of human trafficking. And so I looked at Polaris, the national organization that fights human trafficking in the US. And these are 4 of the areas that they highlighted, and in the DFW area as being number 2 in the US, and truck stops being in the top 10 locations. So I started to narrow in on truck driving stops, whether they were small, medium, or large in size, and the DFW area has them all. And what I first realized was that not all victims of human trafficking self-identify as a victim or a survivor of human trafficking. So initially, I was really naive, and I thought if somebody identifies as a victim of human trafficking, they could download an app, push a button that would call for help, and somebody would swoop in and save the day. And the more I learned through my discovery research and through working with the nonprofits who provide services to victims of human trafficking, most victims of human trafficking are either sex trafficked, labor trafficked, or trafficked through their family. And the familial trafficking is actually the most common. And so they often didn't identify as a victim of human trafficking. So I started to look to refine my location, and my initial question was, how could a modified form of technology enable truck drivers to report suspected cases of human trafficking at a higher rate? So I knew nothing about truck drivers. I knew one truck driver, like an old friend of my dad's, and I called him up and I was like, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I want to learn. I want to learn about the different technologies that truck drivers use, how they use them on a daily basis, why they're using them. And so I learned about a truck driving school right outside of the Fort Worth area. And so I thought, I'm going to go to truck driver school. So I went, and this is the driving range. And they would come in and practice driving, but they would also practice, the different technology they used, and the different capacities they needed to know on a daily basis for traveling as a truck driver. The two drivers you see here have over 50 years of experience, and they were amazing. This is where I learned my first big lesson in interviewing people. So I had called the driving range and I asked to come. I told them what I was doing, that I had an international review board approve all of the work that I was doing, all the questions that I was doing. And they said, yes, come onto the driving range. We'd love to work with you and answer any of your questions. So I did that, and I introduced myself and who I was. But the two gentlemen and the people around me didn't quite understand why I was at the driving range. And so initially they thought that I thought human trafficking was happening here. And so they got really upset with me and asked me to leave. And so I engaged in conversation with them still. And I said, no, I didn't think it was happening here, but I do think you hold a lot of knowledge around the different types of technology that are used on a daily basis that I need to understand, so that way I know how to incorporate the technology so that truck drivers feel safe in reporting something. So as soon as we had this conversation of what my expectation was and what their expectation was as well, it was just a deluge of information. Where to go, what truck stops to avoid. Like even during the daytime, they were telling me which ones not to go to unless I had somebody with me. Where I could go and have pie with truck drivers, which my husband and I did every Friday night for 2 months. And it was really just a way for me to engage with truck drivers in a way that I hadn't been able to before. So once I started interviewing truck drivers, what I learned is that, they're driving a lot. And so they have a lot to say. Do I need to do anything with that alert? No, okay. They have a lot to talk about, and it was amazing. I would be on the phone with them for about an hour and a half total, and they would send me screenshots of their rigs, the different types of technology they used, and then they would even send me screenshots of their phone, which I'll show you as well. So the two forms of technology you see here is the Garmin on the right, which many of us know as a way of doing directional or finding your way from A to B. And then Qualcomm on the left is their onboarding computer. And many truck drivers have this in their rig on the dashboard. And this is a way for what they would say is like Big Brother to sort of track what they were doing. Like when they were driving, when their engines were off, when the engines were on, how long they were driving for, the number of hours, the number of miles. And so because they felt like Big Brother was often watching them, they would turn it off and then turn it on and self-report later on. And because neither of them, like the Garmin really doesn't have a reporting device, so that was immediately out. And then the Qualcomm, because many of them didn't like to use it, that was immediately out as an option as well, to incorporate something for them to report suspected cases of human trafficking. So the phone, of course, became the most logical next option. So what I learned is that truck drivers love apps. So there were a lot of professional driving programs that they would utilize. Some of them were from Love's, Petro, and MyPilot. And so what they would do is anytime they would buy diesel at these locations, they would earn a point. And every point could be spent inside the station on things like food, showers, laundry, a movie, things that they needed like every day, that they didn't themselves have to spend money on. They could use those points that they collected. So many of them loved these professional driving programs. Another reason they were popular is because they could reserve a safe place to park. So many of them knew if they were like driving for Best Buy or certain big named items, that they would want to park at these locations because they knew they were going to be more likely safe than off the side of an exit. So of all the different types of technology, I themed all of the information that I received back in the interviews. And what I learned is that truck drivers use almost all and every technology that you can think of. The most common technology associated with truck drivers is the Citizens Band Radio, the CB. And many of them turn this off because they heard so many solicitations of sex or drugs that they turned it off unless there was inclement weather or an accident. And so this was really not an option. And this was a really interesting thing for me to learn. And I'll introduce why once I introduce the technology we created. This is the truck stop that my husband and I went every Friday night to have pie, and we would sit in the truck driver section, and truck drivers, I said, love to talk. And so as soon as I told them why we were there and what we were doing, we would sit with them and have dinner or have pie and just chat with them as they were waiting for something to happen. This station sat about 200 drivers. It was a pretty large station just west of Fort Worth. So you have restaurants, a travel station, they can get their truck or their rig fixed, or any repairs they needed done. They could fill with gas and diesel. There were 3 different hotel locations here from varying prices from like $25 a night up to $70 a night. There was a chapel for ministry, a truck wash, and then many small cars that could visit in the back. So what I learned was that truck drivers often didn't know how to report a suspected case of human trafficking. And what would happen is if somebody knocked on their rig, they couldn't be able to tell the difference between somebody who was opting there as a sex worker or if they were being trafficked as a sex trafficking victim. And so what they felt like they had 3 options, that they would either invite them in, refuse them, or call the national hotline, which is the 888 number they're referencing in this quote. And so often when the 888 number was called, police were also included. And when police showed up and the truck driver began to speaking to the police with the victim in front of them, the victim would then retract everything that they said because they knew that the person controlling them was nearby and would get scared. The other thing they saw was they have an advantage of being really high. And so they could see into cars and spaces that you and I just don't see every day. And so one of the things that I learned was that when I'm doing interviews is to allow people to talk about whatever they want to talk about. You know, I had a set of questions that I would engage with, but there was one truck driver that I was talking with, and we were at like an hour and a half at this point. And he was wonderful. He'd provided me with so much great information. And I said, okay, I'm going to let you go. And he's like, wait, I have this one last story I want to tell you. And I was like, absolutely. And this was the story that he told me. And he said, I wish there was an app for me to report suspected cases of human trafficking because I needed to get my load from A to B in a certain amount of time. And I knew if I stopped to help or if I stopped to do something that I would be penalized for not getting it from A to B. In this case, the gentleman did stop and call the police and was able to report the car that he saw. But for many cases, they're not always able to do that because of various reasons. So in 2014, I developed an app that was very basic, and it was really focused on reporting suspected cases of human trafficking. I developed a partnership with Mosaic Family Services, one of the largest nonprofits in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, focused on human trafficking and domestic abuse. And their shelter not only accepted women, but they accepted men and the LGBTQAI+ community. And they also spoke up to 23 languages. So they were a wonderful partnership to begin working with. They also, we had a working relationship with the Dallas PD, and we all agreed that it made the most sense not to incorporate the Dallas PD into this partnership because most likely the community would respond in a more favorable way to the nonprofit. And so we chose to leave them out unless there was an instance where we really feel like they needed to be engaged. And I don't feel like there was one instance that they were engaged, but I also wasn't always privy to that information. So if you remember, I said that the CB radio was the most common form of transportation associated with truck drivers. And the reason they kept it off was because they heard so much solicitation for sex and drugs. And so one of the functionalities that I included because of that information I learned was make a recording. And so the nonprofits loved this option to make a recording. because they felt like if a victim needed to report something that was happening around them, they could record it and submit it if they needed to, so that there was some record of it being submitted to Mosaic Family Services so that we could hold it for them. So another thing I did was I created posters of some of the things that I learned when working with specific areas. When we were working with different segments, we realized that it was more important to educate certain people about human trafficking and what it looked like than the entire community, than the general public. So we focused on human trafficking, and then truck drivers. And then when Mosaic got involved, we decided to start focusing on people who install alarm systems, who are restaurant inspectors, people who get to see in spaces that you and I don't get to see every day. We might be in a restaurant, but we're not in the kitchen, so we don't know who's back there, what's going on. Pizza delivery people, people who had that insight that you and I just don't get to have. And so whenever we learned a new quote, we would create something, a poster to hang up, whether it was in the kitchen or at a truck stop. And this is really intentionally supposed to be a gut check, because human trafficking can be happening to the person next to us and we wouldn't know. And so it's supposed to look like this very nice, idyllic day, and then a bit of a punch with the quote. What I also learned, I was asked to be a part of the North Texas Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And what I learned by sitting next to law enforcement, service providers, people who were on the ground every day working for victims and survivors of human trafficking, was that long-term relationships and design really provided me a way to scale or change the way I interacted with them. So what would often happen is I would be sitting in those meetings and they would be talking about a need, but not necessarily saying, I need this type of functionality to help me find a bed, find like a bed in a shelter for a victim of human trafficking. And so when I would hear all of them saying that, I'd be like, okay, it sounds like you need a piece of technology that does this. And so it gave me the leverage and the opportunity to really provide a scalable difference in the world of human trafficking that I didn't have prior to, because I wasn't being asked to sit at the table with them. So it was exciting to be able to do that with them. What I also learned through Operation Compass was that the voices of the victims and survivors of human trafficking were often missing from the solutions. And being really invested in making sure that voices were heard, I was really interested in figuring out how I could help students understand that if you're doing a project on complex social issues or a research project, make sure that you're working with the community and not for the community. So Teresa Moses and I met each other in grad school at the University of North Texas. And we were both really passionate about doing anti-racist, anti-oppressive design. And we were both doing this in all of our classes. And of course, we were sharing with each other, like, this is what we're doing. We would go to conferences and present it. And so we had many colleagues walk up to us and ask, how are you doing it? How are you getting away with it? And so we decided to create Racism Untaught to help other educators engage in conversations on anti-racism. So we define racialized design as design that perpetuates elements of racism. And in the research study, we divided it out into three different areas: artifacts, systems, and experiences. And I'm going to give you an example of each. So an example of an artifact are the Black archetypes in food packaging. So Aunt Jemima syrup, Uncle Ben's rice, Eskimo pies, Chiquita banana. And I'm sure you can think of more without me having to mention that as one example of an artifact. A system would be the digital disparities and technologies in the world of online education. We saw this very evident in the COVID-19 pandemic when it was, or epidemic, when it was, when you saw students sitting outside of Starbucks jumping on the Wi-Fi, or if a family had one computer, it was negotiating like who got to use it, the student or the person who needed to go to work. Then the experience of microaggressions that perpetuate the unbelonging. So being asked the question, what are you? Where are you from? Or where are you really from? Another example I like to use is Robert Moses. So Robert Moses is an urban architecture from the 1940s in New York City, who purposely built a bridge system on the left there. The bridges were 9 feet tall so that the public buses at 12 feet tall could not get to certain areas of the city. So that was the artifacts. And then he created systems, policies that required certain oppressive urban transportation systems. And he put them into policy and said he put them into policy for this reason. And then the experiences that he stated were that so white upper middle class people could get more easily from A to B. And so the experience of somebody who lives in a Black and brown community or a low socioeconomic community was that they were almost prohibited from certain areas of the city. Because this was also during a time when most people didn't own cars, or if they did, they were most likely a part of the dominant culture, which is white, male, Christian culture. And so it allowed them to more easily get to these areas rather than other. So when it was put into policy, other cities then adopted the same form of urban transportation, which then made it a lot easier for other cities to adopt the same form of transportation, which then it becomes an invisible form of racism that we perpetuate. So this is one of the bridges today. So these bridges still exist. The system issues that we're talking about that he created in the 40s still exist for the same reasons. This is another example of an artifact. So if you'll notice, the gentleman on the left is a Black man with his hair cut short, and he's holding his same head with an afro. And Nevaeh put over him, "Re-civilize yourself." They put out a non-apology, as I like to call them, because I don't really think it's an apology, of why they felt like it was okay for them to have done that and that they would try to not do it again. Nevaeh is super guilty of these types of ads. This is one of many examples that Nevaeh has out there. Does anyone know who this is? This is Ashton Kutcher. Yeah, this is the commercial, and he displays many tropes in that commercial. I'm not going to play the commercial for you, but if you find it, it is a really interesting commercial. And again, this is another non-apology. And the reason we like to show contemporary examples of racialized artifact systems and experiences is because we could really easily grab from like the Jim Crow era and say, look how racist this was. But it's still happening today. And so it's important to acknowledge the contemporary artifact systems and experiences that are being developed as design outcomes right now. But the reason we created Racism Untaught is because we really believe that this can change. And like our friend at Antoinette Carroll at Creative Reaction Lab, she says, like all systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design. Therefore, they can be redesigned. So if you don't know Creative Reaction Lab, they're amazing. They're in St. Louis, and they offer a lot of students opportunities through fellowships and internships. And they also support other organizations that have the same efforts that they do. So if you're looking for something focused on equity and oppression or anti-oppression, I strongly recommend you follow them on LinkedIn or Instagram. So the Racism Untaught framework uses the design research process. And instead of beginning with empathy, we decided it was really important for people to be able to contextualize a racialized prompt. And so instead of waiting for people to empathize with racism, we felt like we would be waiting a while. It would be more important to contextualize it. And so in the framework, we provide over 120 different elements of racism. We've also added elements of ableism, capitalism, and sexism. And the last step, we've changed from test to impact because we're overhearing that wasn't my intention. While good intentions are great, we really need to make sure that we're understanding the impact of our final deliverables and our final designs. And so impact needs to be understood before we do the final deliverable. And then we acknowledge that empathy, while it's important, we're not omitting it from the process. We find that it builds over time the more we learn and understand the racialized prompt that we're trying to reimagine. This is what the framework looks like right now. This is what everyone used today in the workshop. This is what it would look like after an 8-hour workshop. This is what it looks like after a 16-week course. I run this also digitally. in a class. So in the example, I'm going to run you through the framework, and in the example that we're going to do.
Actually have this framework reserved right now, so I wasn't sure.
Sorry. That's okay. So I'm going to run you through the framework, and we're going to use the Robert Moses prompt as an example. And I'm going to show you some student work of a student who was prompted with the Robert Moses. So the first step again is context. And if I were to select 8 different elements of racism to apply to the Robert Moses artifact, it would be systemic racism, institutional racism, redlining, power, anti-Black racism, aversive racism, intent over impact, and explicit bias. And on each of the cards, we not only provide the term, but the definition. We then ask participants to engage in the levels of oppression. So this helps them further contextualize the prompt even more. So we ask them to consider the personal beliefs that someone might have to hold for that prompt to have reached the public domain. How did they put that belief into action? Institutionally, how was that act supported? Did someone say something, or was there a disapproval? And if there was nothing done, that itself is also an action and not doing anything. And then culturally, how is the behavior supported culturally and reinforcing the personal beliefs? So if we were to look at the Robert Moses example, the belief that Robert Moses had, that was that Black people and people from low socioeconomic communities should not be allowed on the beaches in New York City. So that the action was that he built a transportation system that prohibited them or made it more difficult for them to actually reach those locations. Institutionally, it was approved by policy approval. And then culturally, his form of urban transportation permeated the New York City. This is just one example of what he did in New York City. The next step is define, and this is where we ask participants to do qualitative or quantitative research methods to help them further understand the prompt that they have. And so some examples that we have from this pulled for the Robert Moses example is the development of personas, heuristic analysis, maybe a graffiti wall, a hero's journey. I have all of my students do a lit review and a research plan, and then they do surveys and a popular media search. So when students are developing a question, we're often asking them to do it in a collaborative space because racism on taught is always done in a collaborative space. And so we ask them to consider, with what they have learned from doing some like discovery research and the context step, we ask them to consider, what change do you want to see? What action needs to happen for that change to occur? And what stakeholders need to be involved to make that change sustainable? And so the thesis question that they're guided with is, how might design be used to create a specific action in order to create change with specific stakeholders? So for the Robert Moses example, the student created the question, how might design be used to educate our peers in order for them to understand how urban transportation systems negatively impact people of color and people from low socioeconomic communities? So with the research that this student created, she did something really cool, which is sort of integrated a whole bunch of different things here. So you might see like the empathy map with the do, say, think, feel, and the heuristic analysis with her saying, like, at this point in the process, the participant was unhappy with a red happy face to the green with the happy face. And then also it's a journey map, because it's not just a heuristic analysis, it's a journey map of how somebody got from A to B, as well as developing a persona. And she did this with 3 different ones based off of all of the interviews that she conducted to learn how people use the urban transportation system. She then used this information to think, how can I use this information to answer that question I created? How can I create something that will help people understand how people are affected by the urban transportation system? So we have over 120 different cards of different artifact systems and experiences. And we ask students to consider, like, how can they layer those ideas? How can they create an artifact that helps refine their question, help answer their question, and helps them work towards their goal. So the student was really interested in creating a game. So the next step we do is have them ideate, like throw in some sticky notes, what your ideas are, what you plan to do, and is the idea that you're working on still supporting oppressive thought, or are you working towards anti-oppressive actions? Are you focused on good intentions, or are you really truly understanding the impact that your idea could have? And sometimes what happens is that students will start over intent and anti-oppressive, but the more you layer the ideas, you get towards impact. So then the students started to prototype low, mid, and high fidelity prototypes. So this was the first prototype. I think we played this game maybe 4 or 5 times in class. I know the student played it by herself like 2 or 3 times with peers and students a few more times to really refine the game. So initially, this is what it looked like when she brought it in. And initially, we all got to the end super quick, which was not a true reflection of the Robert Moses urban transportation system. So then she started to create cards that divvied out different powers and privileges that we either earn or bestowed upon us at birth. And so because of that, it became harder for some people to get to the end of the game, and still it was super easy for others. So it was becoming more and more accurate. This is one step from the final deliverable where she was really refining like the cards and the rules of the game. And it became so impossible for some people that they never got past the first bridge. And then it still became very easy for others to get to the very end. The last thing that I ask students to do is consider the impact that they're having. And so we have a set of cards for them to consider how they want to make sure that they're understanding the impact of their final deliverable. So this student selected a strategy plan workshop, a pledge, innovation brief, entry and exit surveys, a vision statement, and values. So this is what the game looked like at the very end. It took them about 4 weeks to work through the low, mid, and high fidelity prototypes. And honestly, I wish this was just like a real game. Like I wish I could bring this into class and we could play it because it was really well thought through. So I thought I'd show you some other research based off of some prompts that students have. So the student that was prompted with this research, they were prompted with the question, where are you from? And so what they did is they put up graffiti walls around the school, both in our building, the Art and Design building, but also in the Union. And the last question that they asked is, how would you rather be greeted, instead of being asked the question like, what are you? And a lot of people just said, just say hi. So she created a campaign. It was hashtag just say hi. And it was based off of the idea of like, do you really need to know? Sorry, I was afraid that my juice is almost running out. I don't think it is. Based off of the idea of where are you really from, or just say hi. And it was based on the idea of like, do you really need to know? What do you need to know about me for us to have a conversation? Do you need to know my sexuality? Do you need to know the origin of my ethnicity? Do you need to know my race? And if the answer is no, then maybe you don't ask the question. Another example is the Marc Jacobs fashion show, where Marc Jacobs had all of the white models wear dreads. And he, in his non-apology, he was quoted as saying, I don't see color, I see people. That's why I like to call them non-apologies, because usually they still bury themselves even in the apology. And so this student was really focused on the idea of the archetypes in comic books that were culturally appropriated. And he didn't really quite understand how that was so until he started to really unravel some of the things that he idolized in the comic books. And so the comic book that he created was based off of highlighting some of those appropriations. So this was a low fidelity prototype. This is the mid fidelity prototype. And this is a high fidelity prototype. I also had graduate students try and help me understand why Chief Illini Weck, a former mascot at the University of Illinois, was still very present on campus when I arrived over 10 years later. And I wanted them to help me understand the power structures that existed on our campus that allowed it to still be very present. And so they created an exhibit, and at the end of the exhibit, they wanted to understand, like, did you know what we just showed you? And if not, like, what was your response of learning it? And so they created this diagram to help us understand, like, who the participant was and what they learned. So these are our partners that we work with. We work with Target a little differently. We do a train the trainer program with them where we trained the head of product design and then 3 of her colleagues. And then they in turn trained over 600 of their employees with a Racism on Top framework. And then we trained additional employees in the second year, and then they trained over 1,200 vendors using the framework as well. We had a book that was published in October of 2023. And it also has the Robert Moses example as a case study in it, if you're interested in reading more about the research the student conducted and all the work that was done. And we also have a podcast that we created that corresponds with each chapter of the book. And I think you all had Dr. Cheryl D. Miller here. If you did, I saw the nod. Yeah, that's what I thought. And I'm not sure if you had any others, but they are all amazing, wonderful people. And I always learn so much from them. And so one of the things that we thought was, if people can just hear what we get to hear when we talk to these amazing people, then we know we're going to really be able to share something. And so that was really one of the driving factors of creating a podcast. I often get asked the question, like, what books do you recommend? What are you reading? One of my favorite books is Epistemic Injustice. If you don't know where to start, or if you don't read academic books in order, which I usually don't, start with chapter 7. It talks about the value and importance of having the language to talk about our experiences. And it talks about the development of the word sexual harassment and how it didn't exist before the 1970s. And so when they went to create a lawsuit against somebody that had been sexually harassed at work, there was no word for them to do that. And so this book outlines the process that it took. And so it's the value of having the knowledge and a word that goes with a lived experience. And so it's an amazing book for that reason. All of the other books are amazing. Of course, Teresa Moses was also in that book on the left, An Anthology of Blackness. I'm biased. She's a good friend, but I would absolutely recommend it. And that's it. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. Does that sound good? Okay. A matrix. Lower which one? This one?
Yeah, just on the main computer.
Oh my gosh.
Ooh, mouse. Where's the mouse? Okay. So we're gonna lower that. Or actually. We can ask. So we can see the full room. And we
Okay.
can have people asking questions.
Perfect.
There are 2 from the chat.
Okay. Do you want me to start with the 2 in the live chat?
How about we have your.
Yes, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Firstly, thank you so much for that presentation.
Yeah.
We've got some questions in the chat that we'll ask first. This one's from Anthony Zo. What is the success rate of these artifacts in changing someone's internal racism? And also, what can be done to sort of increase that success rate and impact?
So, I don't have hard numbers of how many people we've turned from racist to anti-racist work, but I do know that, like, when people start to engage with our work, or when they're asked to come to like an 8-hour workshop, where they're often like, really, it's going to be 8 hours. And then typically at the end of the workshop, they're like, it needed to be longer. I need more time with you. I have more questions. And so what we often say to them is like, this is just the start for you. you really need to engage in the community and readings and different capacities to help really continue that effort of working towards anti-racist work. So I would not claim that racism and taught like is going to solve racism. I don't think that's true, but I do think that we create a space. Well, I hope that we create a space for people to ask questions, to learn new language, and potentially as one place that they might be able to find some answers. Yeah.
Once again, thank you so much for your incredibly insightful presentation. I'm just gonna read another question from the chat before we go to the students in this class's questions.
Yeah.
So this question says, how do you know in your design process that you are fully considering groups you might not be a part of or identify so that you do not have inappropriate design choices, even when your intention is good? For example, if someone is not even aware of a potential insensitivity due to the community they were raised in.
Yeah, I mean, to say that we're going to be able to eliminate, final deliverables that don't have a negative impact is false, in the same way that I think this will solve racism. But I think the less or the more deep we do the work, the more we're willing to engage in community and work with community rather than for community, I think we can start to solve some of the issues with them instead of for them, which then should solve the issue of not even knowing what to know, right? I mean, there's that thing again of how do we know what we need to know when we don't know it? And I think if we're working with community members from that community, then it's of course not going to eliminate that possibility entirely, because we're then counting on the fact that we're creating space for the community members to be really involved. Or is it just sort of a performative action? Well, I did it with community, but maybe I didn't include them from the very beginning. Maybe it was, look what I created for you. Do you like it kind of thing? And it was more of a shallow question. And so I think as long as we're willing to do like a deep dive in each area of the design process with the community we're designing with, we can start to eliminate the possibility that we're designing something that doesn't actually meet the mark. And I think that's why the last step impact is so important, because if I put something into the public domain that I have done a sincere effort of working with that community, it's more likely that my good intentions may have not been good enough, but I can understand the impact. And now I get to iterate, right? So design is an iterative process. So then I can change it and then put it into the public domain to make sure that it really does. Like this framework in itself, we started with over 30 elements of racism in 2018. Now we have over 120. So just like we have learned in the development of this framework, hopefully in collaboration, when we're creating final deliverables, we can learn from community just as iteratively.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So,
Hi.
I just want to thank you for doing the workshop earlier and
Yeah.
also the presentation. It's very insightful, very interesting. I'm going to start us off with the first question from the diverse perspective class. So the first question is, what is the biggest lesson you have learned working with clients as a freelancer?
Oh yeah, as a freelancer, I mean, some basics that I've learned is create a good contract and make sure you have a timeline of when you're getting paid and the last option of that date. I think those were some of the hardest conversations for me to engage with when I first started out as a freelancer. I first started doing freelance work in 2003, and I didn't have money to buy like a computer. And so I started charging small businesses in the area I was living $500 for a website. And I quickly was able to get enough money for a computer, a printer, and things like that. And then, of course, my prices went up, because I actually had what I needed. And so the other thing that I've done is I've worked as an intern. So I guess my point is that I just don't be afraid to be a little vulnerable in making those decisions for yourself, but a good contract is always a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got another question here. Can Can you share any lessons learned from your own journey as a young creative that might inspire or resonate with aspiring designers who are passionate about social impact and inclusion?
Absolutely. So, when I graduated from my undergrad in 2000, there were, I wouldn't say there were none, but it was not as prominent to find a studio that was focused on social impact work like I can find today. But that isn't to say that it's still very prevalent, right? It's still something that you have to seek out. It's not something that you can just like throw a stone and find it, like you could find a studio, right? And so I would say follow people on LinkedIn and social media who are really interested in the work that you're doing. So like I mentioned Antoinette Carroll at Creative Reaction Lab. I would absolutely follow her if I were still a student because she and her team, I should say too, are amazing. And they in turn share opportunities that I might not know about. George A. at Greater Good Studio in Chicago is his studio is always putting out opportunities for young creatives. And so I would look towards, and even Cheryl D. Miller, Dr. Miller, on LinkedIn, she places a ton of internship and job opportunities for not only people who have maybe been in the field as long as I have, but for emerging designers. So follow those people who are really inspiring and doing the work that you want to do, because often, I know for me, like I'll share that opportunity because I want you all to know about it. Like it's pretty cool. So that would be my recommendation. Yeah.
We have another question from the chat, and it reads, when you are creating, for example, a game, who is your target audience? How do you decide who your target audience is? And they ask because the concepts that you're trying to bring across, for example, in the game.
Absolutely. So if I were to look at like the game I just presented, the student was really focused on educating her peers within the school. And so the idea was, how can we help other students understand the intentions and the impact of their work? And so the thought was, if she can help them understand the impact of an urban transportation system, then they could sort of bridge that concept into the work that they were doing. And so for her, I know that was the conversations that we were having. It was really focused on her peers. I know we had another student who, well, there's another example in Shaker Heights, Ohio. There is a neighborhood full of predominantly Black community members and another neighborhood full of predominantly white community members. And in the 1960s, they put up barriers between these two communities because they didn't want the Black community members to drive through the white neighborhood. And so they put up these barriers. And to this day, two of those barriers still exist. They still can't remove these barriers. And so we had another student who was prompted with that experience. And he created a game so that way policymakers could understand the effects of policy change. And he actually interviewed policymakers. And so the reason I give you those two examples is because I think it's sort of dangerous in creating games for the general public, right? Like you have to think of your audience in a very intentional way, which I think maybe Anthony knows. And so those two individuals, we were having conversations about how it could impact those two different audiences.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Could you discuss any significant milestones or achievements that have shaped your career? I know you were talking about how you went from like web design and then you jumped back into like more graphic design, and that you wanted to like focus on like human trafficking and like important social issues.
Yeah. Well, honestly, so the question is the points where like my career shifted because of those moments. I mean, my grad degree, it was 15 years. I went back later to get my grad degree. I didn't go from undergrad to graduate. I had 15 years in between, and I had a lot of, life experiences and to pull from for my graduate degree. And I have had people ask me, like, do you think you should have gone back earlier so you could have become an educator? And I was like, no, I really think I should have done it the way I did it, because I really learned a lot in industry. There's something about working in a very fast-paced environment where you really have to learn on the job, as opposed to my experience in academia, which has allowed me to really slow down to understand the impact that I'm having. Because I think time is a major factor that we don't really talk about when it comes to design, right? we want to talk about like the intentions or the impact that we want, but we don't often talk about the time that is required for that to happen. And so I think that was a big lesson for me is time, and then my graduate degree, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, another question here. How do you envision the future of diversity and inclusion within the art and design world? And what steps do you think are necessary to achieve that vision?
Well, what I'd like for there to be is a space where liberatory design can happen, where it can be, I mean, right now there's a real fight against efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, we see that being played out at the national scale. But I think there are so many amazing designers who are still doing this work that needs to happen. And so for me, it's making sure that I am supporting that work in every way that I can. So if I can do a podcast where I'm echoing the voices of my peers who are amazing, I'm going to do it. Or if I can mention their names when I'm giving a talk because I believe in their work, I'm going to do it. And so I would say for me, it's just looking at my sphere and my area of influence and really making sure that I'm supporting the voices of the people who are on the ground doing this liberatory work that I believe in. So yeah.
Thank you. So you showed an incredible list of all the companies that you've worked with within the Racism Untaught framework. And I was just curious if you have any, I don't know, anecdotes or experiences that you'd like to share about working with these companies and how it's impacted them.
Yeah. Absolutely. Some of my favorite anecdotes is when people learn a word that goes with an experience, because often what happens is we'll have a person of color who's had a racialized lived experience, but didn't know there was a term that was associated with that. And so they'll say like, I didn't know that this was a word. They usually steal our elements of racism, but they don't really steal. They're like, we're going to take this. And then they would take it, you know, and so we sell it now because so many people want those words. And we even had somebody say, I want to take this deck to work so that when somebody does something to me, I can pull out the card and be like, this is what you're doing right now. And so they would have the words, right? So it's the language. And then I also see people who are white who say, if I'm missing this, then what else am I missing? And so it's the agency that I see participants engaged in that really drive me to want to do this work more. Yeah, I would say language is big.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And so did like your thought process or like the development of racism untaught change at any time in having to like learn from this process?
Yeah, so Terry and I, we developed racism untaught pretty quick. And I'm really lucky. I work with somebody who we have a similar work process or way of working, like a process. And we also went to grad school together. So we had similar language already because of, you know, we learned from the same advisors. So we really lucked out in that respect. So when we created it, when we wrote the book, we were really trying to figure out like, how did we do this? And so we had the idea in May of creating it in 2018. And by August, we had developed it. And we called Antoinette at Creative Action Lab. She was hosting a Diversity Plus Design conference. And she was amazing. We said, Antoinette, we have this idea. We're thinking of it, you know, looking like this. Can we try it at the conference for the first time ever? And we just developed this like 3 months ago. And she was like, absolutely, so amazing. And so we went in, and it was actually one of the best places to do it because everyone there were people interested in working on complex social issues in design. So they gave us great feedback. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question. That was how we created it. And then of course, it's just been iterative ever since. So,
Your
yeah.
process just as a whole
Yeah.
throughout your presentation is just so amazing.
Oh,
Especially
thank
like
you.
your research part, you're just very in depth with it.
Yeah.
I'm really like inspired by it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it's always important when I'm talking to students for you to know like where I've messed up, because I think it's normal to sort of mess up and then iterate, right? And that's why like the value of understanding your impact is so important. So thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, we have another question from the chat regarding the games again. where do your students acquire knowledge for a game? Knowledge in terms of examples of racism in a certain group. I know that one that you mentioned was based on the Robert Moses bridge situation.
Yeah.
And also, how long does it take to make a game? I know you wanted
Yeah.
to mention like 4 weeks. Can you expand on like more of that?
Absolutely. So when we have students doing the Racism on Top framework, we have them do low, mid, and high fidelity prototypes. And we do it very intentionally because what I find that students do is they love to go from low to high and final deliverable in like a week. And so we really try to slow it down. There's that time again, right? So we really make them make sure that this low fidelity is really what you want it to be. Like maybe you're doing 2 or 3 low fidelities to really refine that work. And then the mid-fidelity prototype is usually like maybe some printed, some sketching still involved, as you could, I don't still have my thing up or else I'd show you. But the second mid-fidelity, it wasn't even near final deliverable. She was still handwriting some of the cards. She was still sketching out ideas. And then the high fidelity was like 1 step away from final deliverable in terms of making very few changes. So I would say it does take about 4 weeks for all of that to happen. But I think also because our research process really requires that the students pull from research, this isn't something that they're coming up with in their head. So a lot of the ideas that this student pulled from were directly from their research. So when she was creating all the power and privilege cards on the right, she was pulling content from her research. She wasn't just coming up with it on the fly. And so I think it takes some of that time away from having to ideate because you have the information at your fingertips. You've already done all that work. And so when you're really starting to get to like the prototyping step, you have all the information there. It's just pulling it together to make what you want to create. Yeah.
Okay, so the last question that we have is in terms of your artistic style and more specifically your design process. How do you think that your design process has evolved over your career, especially like doing grad school in design research?
Yeah. So before I went to grad school, I don't think that I talked about my research as design research. I didn't have that language yet. So I would say I learned the language in grad school, and I also learned more methodologies. One of the things that I did in grad school was I minored in anthropology, and that was just an amazing intersection of design for me. The understanding of human behavior from an observational standpoint, and then incorporating those methodologies into my design practice. I mean, it just changed the way that I thought about design, and in such an exciting way. But yeah, I would say that was a major shift for me. And then from doing the research that I presented today and then other forms of research, I'm really now interested in focusing on ethics and how we create plural or multiple ways of thinking around ethics to support different cultures and ways of making. And so it's sort of, I feel like there's a thread through all of my work that has led me to right here. And I'm also really comfortable with ambiguity. I'm really comfortable not knowing always what's going to happen next. But yeah, I would think that would be it.
Thank you for answering all of our questions.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to pretend to be Clarissa and do the outro for you guys.
I will be better.
Okay. So normally Clarissa would be here, as you all know, but for the sake of our live viewers, I'm going to do the outro on her behalf. Me, Clarissa, and Heather, and the department as a whole, this class really want to thank you for joining us, taking the time to come all the way here and participate, not only for this live stream, but also taking the time to instruct that very informative and interactive workshop earlier today. It was amazing being able to put a name to all these different experiences that people go through, and it is just really eye-opening as an experience. So we do want to thank you so much for your time. We do want to thank our co-hosts, Kennedy, Hayden, and Melina for moderating. And we want to say that all the live viewers, and this class has to, but we want everybody to feel invited to join us next Wednesday, April 10th, for our next diverse perspective speaker at 5:30 p.m. The wonderful Claudia Owosu is a Ghanaian writer and filmmaker whose work divulges in the nuance of Black girlhood through a personal and collective lens. Check out the entire lineup on our Diverse Perspectives page. We will also be having a handful of other events showing up within the next week as we finish out this season of Diverse Perspectives. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and to follow our other social medias at UConn DMD to see all of our departments' variety of content. We do have 5 different focuses in this department, so you see a lot of really great work from all of our students. The chat has the link to the Diverse Perspectives lineup page for you to check out in your own time. Thank you to all of our students and everyone who worked together to produce this great event. And most of all, thanks to all of you out there in our virtual audience for joining us today. I hope all of you are as inspired about Lisa's work and insights as we are in this Zoom room. There is work to be done, but if we continue to inspire and mentor our young creatives together, we can change this digital world for the better. Bye-bye.